Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the rulebook for the world's biggest democracy, the Constitution of India. Think of this as your user's guide. All right, let's just get right to it. This document is from 1950. It's old. So you've got to be asking yourself, why on earth should I care about some 70-year-old text today? It's a fair question. Well, because it's not some dusty old book in a museum. It's literally the operating system for modern India. And when you understand it, you get the keys. You get the toolkit to understand your fundamental rights, to really grasp how your government works, and maybe most importantly, to actually decode what's going on behind the headlines you see every single day. So here is how we're going to break it down for you. We've got 5 parts. We'll do a quick sprint through its history, look at the insane crisis it was born out of, check out the blueprint for democracy it laid down, see how it's battled it out in the courts, and then wrap it all up with why it still matters so much today. All right, Chapter 1, a sprint through history. Let's do a super fast journey to see how this new nation even got to the point of writing its own rules. So this wasn't an overnight thing. You're looking at a slow 50-year crawl towards self-rule. With each of these acts, the British were basically giving up a little more ground in the face of growing demands. That 1935 Act, that was huge. It was like a pre-written draft. A massive chunk of it, something like 3/4, was actually lifted and adapted for the final constitution. And of course, it all leads up to the big one, independence in 1947. Okay, on to Chapter 2, Forging Unity from Crisis. And this is so important to get. The people writing this thing weren't sitting in a quiet library. No way. They were trying to solve a set of massive, unprecedented problems that were all exploding at the exact same time. First up, just imagine this problem. You have almost 600 different princely states. These were basically little kingdoms, each with its own ruler, its own rules, and the job was to somehow stitch all of them together into one country. Just think about the scale of that for a second. And if that wasn't hard enough, you have the social fabric itself. Society was deeply, deeply fractured by a caste system with over 3,000 distinct groups. We're talking about a centuries-old hierarchy that controlled everything and created massive, profound inequality. And then, casting a giant shadow over all of this was the trauma of partition. The violent division of the country in 1947 led to just horrific violence and displaced millions of people. So the need for a rule book, for something that could just hold the new nation together, wasn't an academic exercise. It was a matter of survival. And this really gets to the heart of it. You had leaders like Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was the chairman of the drafting committee. And he was not romantic about the past. He looked at the traditional Indian village, something many people idealized, and said, hold on, this is actually a source of deep exploitation. He knew that to build something new and fair, they had to be brutally honest about the injustices of the old ways. So that's the setup, a perfect storm of problems. How in the world did they create a blueprint for democracy out of that chaos? Let's jump into Chapter 3 and look at the actual architecture they came up with. Okay, so their first big idea was how to manage all that diversity. They went with federalism, dividing power between the center and the states. But, and this is key, they'd just seen the country torn apart by partition, so they designed a system with a really strong central government. It's like, let the states run their own show, but make sure there's a strong hand at the wheel to keep the whole thing from flying apart. And this is pretty brilliant, actually. This is how they did it. They made 3 lists. The union list, stuff only the central government can handle, big picture things like defense and banking. The state list, things for the states to manage locally, like police and public health. And then a concurrent list for stuff they both have a say in, like criminal law. It's a really clever way to balance power. Then you have the question of who's in charge. They chose a parliamentary system. So you have a president, who is the formal head of state, kind of like the symbolic leader. But the real day-to-day power, that's with the prime minister and their cabinet. And the crucial part is, they have to answer to the people's elected representatives in parliament. They can't just do whatever they want. Now, this next part was absolutely revolutionary for its time. They introduced a whole section on fundamental rights. These weren't just nice ideas on paper. They were legally enforceable rights guaranteed to every single citizen, rights the government couldn't just ignore or take away. This was the foundation, the very cornerstone of individual freedom. So you get all the big ones you'd expect, the right to equality, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, but here's the genius move. They added what's basically a master key to unlock all the other rights, the right to constitutional remedies. What does that mean? It means if you feel any of your fundamental rights have been violated, you can go straight to the Supreme Court. That's what gives these rights real teeth. So you have the hard and fast rights, but they also included something else. Think of it as a moral compass for the government. They're called the directive principles. These are big aspirational goals like social justice and economic equality. Now, you can't take the government to court for not achieving them, but they are written down as being fundamental to how the country should be run. It's the nation's to-do list. And to make sure nobody ran away with the money, they built in some powerful independent watchdogs. And check this out. Dr. Ambedkar called the Comptroller and Auditor General, basically the nation's top accountant, probably the most important officer in the Constitution. More important than the judiciary, that's how seriously they took the idea of keeping an eye on how the government spends public money. Okay, so the book is written, but that's not the end of the story. A constitution isn't something you just write and put on a shelf. It's a living thing. And for the next 70+ years, its very meaning would be fought over, debated, and shaped in the courtroom. This is Chapter 4, the Constitution in Court. Right from the get-go, there was this central tension. On one hand, you want a constitution to be solid, right? A rock. But on the other hand, leaders like Nehru knew they needed to make huge changes to society. So the constitution also had to be flexible, something they could change when they needed to. Solid but flexible, that's a tough balancing act. And that balancing act exploded into a full-blown tug-of-war between Parliament and the Supreme Court that went on for decades. First, in 1951, the court says, yep, Parliament can change anything it wants, even fundamental rights. Then, fast forward to 1967, and the court does a complete 180. They say, nope, scratch that. Fundamental rights are sacred. Parliament can't touch them. This showdown was heading for an epic conclusion. And that conclusion came in 1973, in a legendary case called Case of Ananda Bharti. The court was split right down the middle, but they came up with this brilliant solution. It's called the Basic Structure Doctrine. And here's the idea. Parliament, you can change the Constitution. Go ahead. But you can't change its soul. You can't destroy its fundamental features, things like democracy, federalism, secularism. You can renovate the house, but you can't tear down the foundation. Honestly, this was a total game changer. With this one idea, the Supreme Court basically said, we are the final guardians of this Constitution. It put a massive check on the power of politicians. The message was clear. Your power to change the law is not unlimited. You cannot destroy the core of what this nation stands for. Which brings us to Chapter 5, and back to our original question, why it matters today. How does all this history, the crisis, the clever design, the courtroom battles, actually affect life in India right now? So you can really see the progression here, right? It starts with a crisis that demands a solution. A flexible blueprint gets designed. Then the courts step in and start interpreting it, defining the lines. And all the while, real-world politics is testing it, shaping it, forcing it to evolve. It's this whole journey that makes it a living, breathing document, not just some historical text. And here's something fascinating that shows the legacy of what the framers built. Look at public trust. Year after year, surveys show that people have way more trust in the institutions the Constitution created, like the Election Commission and the judiciary, than they do in political parties. It shows just how important those independent referees are in the system. And I promise you, once you start looking for it, you'll see the Constitution everywhere in today's news. You hear about fights between the central government and states over taxes? Yep, that's federalism at work. See a big court case about what you can say online. That's freedom of speech. Debates on affirmative action, on citizenship. All of these are modern battles being fought on the ground laid out by this 70-year-old document. Okay, so let's boil it all down. What are the big takeaways? 1. It was a product of crisis, a practical solution to huge problems. 2. It's a blueprint for a wildly diverse democracy. 3. It's a living document, constantly being shaped and reshaped. And 4, it is still the ultimate rulebook for understanding India today. And that leaves us with one last big question. The Constitution created a republic. It gave people the tools. But can they keep it? The document itself is just ink on paper. Its survival, its success, that really depends on citizens staying engaged, staying informed, and actively participating. That's all for this one. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer. Hope you found that useful. Our next explainer is all about the rise of the modern regulatory state, so be sure to check that out.